SPJSDX.
We are here about 25.
Would you all please stand? You right here, the rest of you who are here. These are all award-winning journalists, photojournalists, cartoonists, designers, and columnists, and we're very, very happy to have you on campus. Now, to introduce our speaker for today, I would like to introduce one of our journalism students who writes a weekly column, Keenly Speaking, for The Ranger, Tom Keene.
Our speaker was almost a native Texan. He was born in Little Rock, Arkansas. Graduated from Yale University in 1953, served as an officer in the Marines in Korea and Japan, came back to the U.S., became a reporter for the Nashville Tennessean. While he was going to Vanderbilt Law School, working on a law degree, he continued his work with the paper and became managing editor of the Vanderbilt Law Review. Later he attended Oxford University on a Fulbright scholarship and was awarded the Diploma of Law by Oxford in 1960. He returned to Nashville, practiced law there for 3 years. In January of '63, he became the chief counsel to the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitutional Amendments, worked with Senator Estes Kefauver. He returned to journalism in 1965 when the New York Times hired him as the Supreme Court correspondent. In 1972, he became CBS's law correspondent. He has written 3 books: The Self-Inflicted Wound, about criminal law decisions in the Warren Court. He wrote the Alias Program, about the Justice Department's witness relocation program, and he wrote Press Freedom Under Pressure, a study of conflicts between government and the press. In 1973, he won 3 Emmy Awards for his TV coverage of Watergate and the Agnew resignation. In 1974, he won the Peabody Award for his coverage of the Watergate cover-up trial. Our speaker's unique ability to move confidently and clearly among the mazes of law and government and journalism enables him to stand in the tradition of Justice William O. Douglas and see as Douglas did when he spoke of the relationship between law and journalism. Douglas said, "The press will commonly reflect or even try to create the view that the end justifies the means. Those of us dedicated to the law must stand before these gales." In the conversation I had with our speaker just before this moment, we were discussing the role of the press in standing before the gales of the view that the end justifies the means. Our speaker also stands in the tradition of Joseph Pulitzer, who also saw the relationship between the press and the public good. Pulitzer said, "Our public and its press will rise or fall together." An able, disinterested, and public-spirited press with trained intelligence to know the right and the courage to do it can preserve that public virtue without which popular government is a sham and a mockery. A cynical, mercenary, demagogic press will produce in time a people as base as itself. The power to mold the future of the Republic will be in the hands of journalists of future generations. As a lawyer, journalist, lecturer, writer, thinker, our speaker exemplifies the public concerns of us as fellow citizens, of lawyer Justice William O. Douglas, and of journalist Joseph Pulitzer. I'm proud to present award-winning CBS News legal correspondent Fred Patterson Graham.
Well, thank you, Tom Keene, and thanks to you for your warm welcome to me, and really for inviting me back here. I feel very much at home here. I was here, I believe, about 7 or 8 years ago, and before that, I was here in the sense that I grew up in Texarkana, albeit Texarkana, Arkansas, not Texas, and this is a very comfortable part of the country for me, and I always look forward to coming back. Also, there is a certain sense of ease and comfort because this group, you are not lawyers. Most of the time when I talk, it's to lawyers, and most of the time lawyers in Washington, and I spend a good bit of my time with lawyers in Washington, and it's so much so that it's very unusual for me to be in the presence of this many people and not even recognize one unindicted co-conspirator in the whole house. And I feel very much that I am among my own because of the journalists here, the high school journalism students, of course the college students, professors, and others who are interested in what I do and my profession. I do feel that I owe you one bit of explanation about how I came to make that transition that Tom mentioned there from being, which I assure you was a respectable Tennessee lawyer, to practicing my law. God help me, at one point in time on the morning news with Phyllis George, and that is a transition that I think requires some explanation. What happened was, as Tom hinted, was that I had been practicing law, had put myself through law school, though, working as a reporter, and then some years later was hired by the New York Times to be its legal expert. And for years, 7 of them, I wrote a weekly column in the Sunday News of the Week in Review about the law, and I covered the Supreme Court. And my writing on legal subjects was well known, at least to the executives of CBS who were in New York and read the New York Times. So when Watergate happened, Mike Wallace, who was a friend of mine, came to me and said, "Fred, you should just switch from print to broadcasting." And he said, it'll be exactly the same. The substance is the same. You'll be covering Watergate. That's going to be a constitutional and legal story as well as a political story. Sources are the same. And so I did. In November of 1972, very shortly after the Watergate break-in, I wrote my last column for the New York Times on a Friday. And the next Monday evening, I was on the air with Uncle Walter. And it worked just fine, except for one thing, and that was that they didn't know that I talked like this. And there were really some ashen faces among the executives of CBS News up there in New York because the phone was ringing off the wall from all around the country, except this part of the country where it sounded perfectly natural. But other parts of the country, people were calling in saying, "Where did you get that country boy that you put on the TV?" And they looked around to figure out how they'd gotten themselves into this pickle. And it turned out that they never really had more or less hired someone off the street before, that they had used a process that those of you in journalism are familiar with, and that is people in television prove themselves generally at a local station, local affiliate, and then they advance to the network, and regardless of what part of the country they're from, by that time they all talk like Walter Cronkite. And I was the only one who had made this transition, with the exception of Bernard Kalb. Bernard Kalb had worked for the New York Times, had left on a Friday, and had gone to work for CBS on a Monday. But of course the crucial difference was that Bernie Kalb is the brother of Marvin Kalb, who was a veteran television correspondent. And he told Bernie, he said, "There's just one thing you need to know to be a television network correspondent." And he said, "That is, when you ask the question, you point the mic at your mouth And when he answers it, you point it at his mouth. And so Bernie spent that weekend getting his reflexes down, practicing up. And this really happened. And then he went up on Capitol Hill on the first morning, that first Monday morning, for his first assignment, determined to be professional. And the camera was rolling, and he rushed forward for his first television interview and remembered, pointed the mic at his mouth, and said, "Okay, Senator, what do you have to say about that?" Then he took the mic and put it under his arm and took his pad and pencil and wrote down the answer. I want to talk a few minutes about a subject that will be of some interest to you both as people who are interested in journalism and interested in current affairs. And then I hope, using that as a catalyst and a stimulant, that we will then have a dialogue together. You can ask any questions you wish, and be happy to try and answer them, and that way we can be sure we talk about matters of interest to you as well as to me. But first, I do want to talk about a matter that is front and center in my world of journalism, and it's the really intriguing relationship these days between the Reagan administration and the Supreme Court. Nothing like it, quite like it, has existed, not in my tenure of 25 years in Washington, and the closest parallel I know of is the standoff between Franklin Roosevelt and the 9 old men 50 years ago. But to lead into that, let me tell you a little courthouse gossip from my beat, because it very much relates to this intriguing relationship that I'll get to in a minute. You remember it was just about a year and a half ago, a little bit more than that, in the heat of the election campaign between President Reagan and Walter Mondale, that there was a widespread assumption in this country that if President Reagan won re-election, that he would clearly have an opportunity to remake the Supreme Court of the United States in his own conservative image. Walter Mondale said, if Ronald Reagan gets 4 more years, the far right will get 5 more justices. And his reasoning for that seemed to be absolutely solid. After all, 5 of the justices, 5 of the 9, were 75 years old or older. That means 5 of them are 76 years old or older now. It means that as of the end of Ronald Reagan's term, he of course did get a second term, a majority of those 5, assuming no change, would all be in their 80s. It would be by far the oldest Supreme Court we've ever had in the history of our country. We've only had 13 justices serve into their 80s in the 200 years of the court, and we would have 5 at the same time. And human mortality being what it is, no one challenged that assumption that if Ronald Reagan was reelected for 4 more years, their vacancies would occur, and there would be a wholesale opportunity for Ronald Reagan to remake the court. But it's been fascinating how much that assumption has changed in just a year and a half. If you think about it, nobody is talking about that now. And the reason is that 4 of those 5 septuagenarian justices have made it clear in various ways, some subtle and some not so subtle, that they intend to try and outlast Ronald Reagan. And, you know, they're pretty old, but he's no spring chicken either, and it's been a year and a half, and they're well on their way. The ways that they have sort of manifested this are kind of intriguing in themselves. The first thing that happened was that the oldest, Justice Brennan, now 79, eloped with his secretary, ran off to Bermuda with the young lady. She was 63, I believe. And he was a widower, and they ran off and left little notes on the other justices' desks saying what they had done. And Justice Brennan has just taken on new life. You can look at him, and it's true. He just beams, and it's really a rewarding thing to see. Justice Thurgood Marshall, about whom there's been more rumors about leaving than anyone, finally had to make a statement. And his statement was, he said, "I have been appointed for life and I intend to serve my full term," which means, translated, that means they'll have to carry me out of here feet first as long as that man is in the White House. Justice, the third of the aging liberals, it's hard to think of these people as liberals because on any other scale they would not be, but on the scale of the Supreme Court and who would follow them, they're clearly liberals. Harry Blackman, now 77, talks in private a great deal about the longevity in the Blackman family. Claims he has a brother in his 90s and that sort of thing. And he clearly intends to be there a long time. The one who seemed a bit that might leave was Lewis Powell. He was in his late 70s, had not wanted to go on the Supreme Court, had always appeared to be saying that he would leave after 10 years. He's now in his 13th. And his decision to stay on, even after about this time last year, having had a operation for cancer of the prostate, is almost the key to what has happened on the Supreme Court. He, of course, has not said publicly why he decided to stay on and pass the word that he plans to stay on indefinitely. By the way, I remember when Lewis Powell's father was 93, and Lewis was then in his 60s and was a tremendous tennis player, and there's a lot of longevity there too. It seems fairly clear that this almost ghoulish death watch that was going on a year ago last summer, in which all this talk about these old fellows can't make it, they're certain to drop like flies if the president is reelected. I think that in some subtle way, and also the assumption and the statements and the clear intention by the Reagan administration to appoint young, very ideological law professors, right-wing law professors, I think did stir a feeling among some of the justices that perhaps the court should not become that ideological, that perhaps fair-minded decision-making requires an approach that's much more ad hoc and much more focused and not driven by an ideology of the right or the left. And the result is that those four of the five seem clearly intending to stay. Now, at their ages, that can change. But given their carrying out their intention, that of course leaves one, Chief Justice Burger. There was a rumor in print about, a month ago, 6 weeks ago, that Chief Justice Burger was about to retire in order to give President Reagan an appointment to make now. It seems fairly clear that if the Republicans lose control of the Senate in the election coming up this summer, it would become quite difficult for President Reagan to fill a slot on the Supreme Court and get it confirmed in the Senate, assuming a position. Now, particularly if he picked, say, Ed Meese or William Clark, you'll recall who he had appointed Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court a few years back, or William French Smith, one of his former cronies and cabinet members, it would be difficult for him to get such a position confirmed. And so the rumor was spread, and apparently by people in the White House, apparently wishful thinking, that Chief Justice Burger was about to retire. And he normally simply will not comment on rumors like that, but he went out of his way this time to have, there's a public information officer at the court, and she went out of her way to say, no, he is not about to resign. I believe that what the Chief Justice plans to do is to stay on the court until a little bit beyond this time next year. Next year, as you know, is the Bicentennial of the Constitution of the United States, and he, the Chief Justice, is the chairman of the commission that's leading in the observance of that. I think he intends to remain Chief Justice, and then I believe he would want to retire. He will be I think, well, his 80th birthday will be September of next year. And I do believe that at that point, he would want to step aside and would want a fellow Republican, Ronald Reagan, to appoint his successor. But a certain amount of lame duckism begins to intrude upon the scene at this point. And that's where I have the Graham theory, which is based on no sources whatsoever, but just reasoning that I will explain to you now, and you can take it for what it appears to be worth in terms of the logic or the lack thereof that's involved. It will be very difficult for the President to get his nominee confirmed with the opening coming up so close to the end of his term. The Democrats would have every reason to hold off, hoping that there would be a Democratic president who could fill that slot. So, why should not the President, if Chief Justice Burger steps down, appoint in his place his Burger's protege, and who would then become the first woman Chief Justice of the United States, Chief Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, which would then open up her slot for another, a twofer, a second appointment. How about Justice Orrin Hatch? Here you have a woman, a senator. The Senate would be very likely to confirm both and to approve them, and not to make a fight over that. The President gets two appointments and gets to do what presidents love to do, and that is accomplish historic firsts. The first woman Chief Justice of the United States. In the meantime, it's almost hilarious what happens when we go to the Supreme Court to cover the hearings there, and the reporters sit over on the side. It's almost like a meeting of gerontologists. You know, people are saying, "My, doesn't look at the color on Justice Brennan's cheeks. Doesn't he look good?" And looks like Thurgood Marshall has lost a few pounds, and somebody has even come out in favor of mandatory life supports for Supreme Court justices. So this watch is going on, and assuming that the situation stays as it is now and as I've described, of course, the replacement of Chief Justice Burger by a Reagan-style appointee, whether I'm right or not, would not greatly change the makeup of the Supreme Court, because the Chief Justice is one of the more conservative members of the court, and it would be pretty much an even swap. The fascinating result of that would be that the historic change in the makeup and complexion and direction of the Supreme Court would not be determined by the last election, as everybody assumed, but by the next election, by who wins the next election, because I have no hesitancy in predicting that the person who wins the next election in 1988, President of the United States, will remake the Supreme Court in a way that will set its course for the rest of this century. Those judges in their 80s facing a president who probably would be there for 8 years. The psychology obviously would be, all right, regardless of who the winner is, all right, it's time for a change, it's time to leave. If the winner of the next election is someone in the Reagan tradition, Jack Kemp, Phil Gramm, we hear talk about Phil Gramm as a possibility in Washington, or someone else of a decidedly conservative stripe, I think that change in the court that Walter Mondale talked about would simply happen 4 years later. Given a Democrat, and possibly given George Bush, no one knows how that would go, perhaps the court would continue on in the slightly to the right of center tradition that it has for the past 10 years. But that brings me to a few words about this odd relationship that flows, in a sense, from the standoff between the court and a certain amount of tension between the court and the Reagan administration. Because this is clearly not a Reagan court. But an odd thing has happened, and that is that Attorney General Meese has been attacking it as if it were the Warren Court. You'll recall, beginning with a speech before the American Bar Association about a year ago, Attorney General Meese has criticized the Supreme Court for alleged liberal actions. If you read the fine print, what he was basically talking about was the abortion decision and church and state decisions that upheld a rigid barrier between church and state. But it seems that the general impression was that this is in somehow a liberal court like the Warren Court, which would have been implied liberal decisions on criminal matters, criminal suspects matters, civil liberties matters, matters of personal expression and individual rights, questions of the First Amendment, and so on. But indeed, close watchers of the Supreme Court know that it is, if anything, a conservative court in those matters, particularly in criminal matters. The very clear pattern of the Supreme Court of today is that the lower courts, surely the lower federal courts of appeal, and to a large extent the lower state Supreme Courts that feed their cases to the United States Supreme Court, are more liberal than the United States Supreme Court is. And there's a clear pattern of people raising claims of personal rights in the lower courts and saying, my right was violated by the government, by a police officer, by a government bureaucrat, by an investigation committee, by a grand jury, by whatever, and having that claim be upheld in the lower court, but overturned in the Supreme Court. It's hard to quantify these things, but very recently I was reading a study by some law professors in a law journal, and they took a period of 1 year, and it turned out that of all of the prosecutors that appealed their cases to the Supreme Court from around the country, state and federal cases, the Supreme Court agreed to hear and eventually overturn 40% of all of those appeals. Of the defendants who appealed to the Supreme Court, 4% had their cases won their cases in the Supreme Court. And so what you have is this odd anomaly in which the Supreme Court, for most issues, is a conservative court, and it's being attacked by the Attorney General of the United States for being a liberal court. And this has muddied the waters in the public mind to a way which I think has caused considerable confusion. It's interesting that we are coming up next year to the bicentennial celebration of the Constitution, a time at which normally, and I hope this will happen, a great deal of attention will be given in the media and otherwise to looking at our Constitution and saying, how well has it served us, how well does it stand, where are things going right, where do things need to be adjusted, and so forth. And it's interesting that in that context, a lot of people are going to bring to that evaluation a mistaken sense that we still have the Warren Court up there making all these liberal decisions that have thrown the thing out of balance in the scales of law and order, when in fact, other than on a couple of issues such as abortion and perhaps church and state, it's very much the opposite. And in that sense, what has happened in the controversy between Mr. Meese and the liberals on the Supreme Court, the public perception and the public interest in evaluating where we stand has not been served. The outcome, of course, of all of this will not be decided that much by this evaluation that will occur next year, and it's an ongoing thing in this country as to whether our judicially protected legal rights are being asserted and enforced to a degree that that public order is being eroded. That balancing process that we go through in this country, of course, in the end will be determined by the Supreme Court, and as I have said, in my judgment will be determined largely by the next presidential election. However that comes out, as I said, the Supreme Court will change perhaps drastically depending on the complexion of the new next president, so that after 1988, the kinds of, I think there will be potentially an upheaval in the direction of the law, and it will give us all of us who are journalists, lawyers, observers of the scene, and of course just citizens. It will give us I think an added appreciation of why the ancient Chinese sometimes meant it as a curse when they said, "May you live in interesting times." Thank you all very much, and I'll try to answer any question you might want to ask. You're going to have to wave. Yeah, it's a little hard to see, but that man has on a white shirt. That makes it easy.
Fred, you're a keen student of the court. I wonder if you might be able to clarify a little mystery for me. I was involved in a case that was heard before the Supreme Court back in 1972. In the course of the argument, Justice Powell interrupted my attorney, Mike Gottesman, steelworkers union lawyer, and he asked him, first of all, where is Professor Sinderman now? What's he doing? So Mike said, I was there in the courtroom, of course, hearing the case in person. Mike answered properly, he's back in Texas working for a former senator. So Powell probes a step further, a former state senator? And Mike responded, no, a former United States senator. So at that point, Powell turns and grins knowingly at Rehnquist. Justices Douglas, Brennan, and Marshall turned and grinned knowingly at themselves. You know, they were all saying to themselves, we know, it's that son of a bitch Ralph Yarber that he's working for. The guy who got beaten out of the U.S. Senate because he voted against Carswell and Ainsworth's appointment, even though he was a Southerner. So I have been puzzled ever since then. Why? The punch point of this. When we get to the decision, and I read through the decision, it reads, Justice Powell took no part in the decision of this case, nor in the writing of the opinion of the case. So I've been wondering ever since, why would a justice sit on the court, interrupt an attorney with loaded political questions, and then recuse himself from the decision?
Well, before you sit down, do you or your lawyer have a theory as to why he took himself out? As you know, they don't give reasons. What's your theory?
My theory is it was a guilty conscience.
Oh, I'm not suggesting that he does, that the man doesn't have a guilty conscience or a conscience. I can't answer that. I can't answer that, but I can explain what I would assume you know and your lawyer has told you, and that is that sometimes justices don't realize that they have a potential conflict until they hear the argument in a case. It's unusual, but it happens. And if they are sitting in the argument and something is mentioned that makes them realize that because their law firm in their earlier practice represented someone involved in the case, or perhaps in the case of Lewis Powell, he has a son and a daughter who are very successful lawyers. Perhaps they have had a representation that in some way involved. There can be many things that can come up. And he realized in the course of that there was a potential conflict, and without saying any more, he took himself out of the case. I'm sure that's what it was.
Justice Powell asked him flat out, the case is over,
Uh-huh.
I can't sue again, it makes no difference legally. I'd like to know why you asked those questions and why you...
He didn't tell you, did he?
He never answered. So
Well, I've asked Justice Powell, too, why he's Justice Powell is, I think, the wealthiest member of the Supreme Court and has a lot of stock. And he has had to take himself out of a number of cases because somehow it involved a stock holding of his. And I have asked him about that, and he always refuses to answer. And I guess his reason is understandable. That is, if they get into the business of giving explanations, then it could cause trouble and embarrassment for them in a case where they just say, you know, here's one where I really perhaps can't be fair. So without giving a reason, I'll step out.
I wrote to Potter Stewart also. Powell refused to respond. Stewart wrote the majority opinion in my case, which I won, by the way. And he speculated that, well, no, he said, I really can't read the man's mind.
Well, I'm glad you won the case. Yes?
There seems to be a growing perception among the public that you can protest, march, and somehow that's going to sway judicial decisions, particularly in the really emotional issues like abortion, freedom of speech, and such. I wonder, A, where that perception comes from, and B, what is the role of the media to try and let people know that it's not quite the same as a local congressman?
The question, for those of you who couldn't hear it, is a perception in the public that you can affect court decisions by protesting and demonstrating, marching, and so forth. And the gentleman said, I think accurately so, that for the most part that clearly is not true. You know, I don't think that the people who do this really think that they're going to change that decision so much. The obvious one that we're all thinking about now are the abortion cases. The right to life forces in that argument have embarked upon a long-term strategy in which they have really conceded defeat on the legislative side. There is not going to be a constitutional amendment. They can't agree on the one they would want. And they know that that issue will have to be resolved in their favor, if it is to be resolved in their favor, by changes on the Supreme Court. They feel that time is on their side because the Supreme Court's decision, as most or many of you know, upholding the rights of women to have abortions, was keyed to a medical judgment that up to a certain point in a woman's pregnancy, a fetus is not viable outside of her body. Therefore, it is her personal decision as a matter of personal health and her personal bodily physical integrity, and that this is her decision. The people who disagree with that decision are saying, aha, but medical science is advancing the potential to keep fetuses alive at a much earlier period, and that development is going to erode the basis of the decision, and at some point down the line future justices might be willing to overturn it. And that's why, and the reason why they continue to march, I believe, is no hope that this court will change that decision, but to keep the issue alive so that other judges and justices will be appointed and that it will be changed in the future. For those of you who are journalism students, let me take this opportunity to tell you a lot of the story, not a lot, but as a journalist, as I've been now for 20 years, you get into some stories that are just not all that big and not that earth-shaking, but just fascinating. And one of the more intriguing, fascinating stories I have ever covered, I'm going to tell you about. It involves the alleged that someone allegedly took a shot at Justice Harry Blackman, who wrote the opinion in Roe versus Wade, upholding the women's rights to abortions. Justice Blackman has received 45,000 furious letters from people who disagree with that, and he is a figure of great emotion to people who disagree with that opinion. I'll never forget one day there was a big Right to Life rally going on at the Senate office building. It's just a half a block down the street from the Supreme Court. And I was walking by, and there were these people standing there with their placards, and they were chanting, and the police were nervously there because they were at some, generally these things do not get violent, but there was some sense that this thing might just about to get out of hand. And standing on the corner was Harry Blackman. He'd been taking a walk. It was at noon, the noon break. He was standing there. He's a very, he's not exactly a household figure. None of them recognized him. They're going around and they're shouting and screaming, and Harry Blackman was standing there just observing the whole thing. 6 months after that, he and Mrs. Blackman, a lovely lady, were sitting in their apartment in Washington when a bullet came crashing through the window, and he'd been sitting in a sofa. He had just gotten up and was moving toward the door. She was still seated. A bullet comes through the window and impales itself in the sofa. Well, he said, this is, they've gone too far, It's one thing to go around and protest, but to shoot through the window of the justice who wrote the opinion, that's too much. Harry Blackman thought that was beyond the pale. He's really a sweet, wonderful guy, but his attitude toward this was distinctly negative. So I went over to talk to my best sources at the FBI, and I said, are you going to catch the people who are shooting at Harry Blackman? This is outrageous. Let me tell you what they found. The bullet was a 9mm slug, which normally is fired from a handgun. There had been, I guess, 9mm rifles, but very few. So it's probably a handgun. The Blackman apartment is on the 3rd floor of an apartment building that sits on the shores of the Potomac River, looks down upon the Potomac River. And the only thing between it and the river is a freeway. And the ground falls off steeply from the ground floor of their apartment building down past the freeway and down to the river. So that if you stand down there and you're going to shoot through Harry Blackman's window, it's as if I were shooting sort of through that exit sign up there, way up. And you have to stand close because you can't get away. The river's right there. The bullet hole is 8 feet from the sofa. But in traveling that 8 feet, it dropped 2 feet. So here's the FBI trying to figure out who shot at Harry Blackman. And it's clear that either the shot came from a helicopter or from across the river. I went across the river with the FBI people, and we went up and down, and this Georgetown over there, Georgetown University, and it's a kind of a fun-loving part of town where people have been known to have some fun and go down and shoot pistols into the air. It's about a mile from the other side of the river to Harry Blackman's window. The only logical, ballistical explanation of the shot through Harry Blackman's window is that some happy soul, or some soul, stood on the far side, looked over there, and you can barely see the building. It's a huge building. Fired into the air. It went across and went in Harry Blackman's window. Now, if indeed the shot was fired from the far side, there is no way it was intended to go in Harry Blackman's window. You can barely see the skyscraper from over there. But on the other hand, and so you have to say, one logical explanation is that it had to be logically someone who just fired a random shot from across the river. If you look at it from the other point of view, from his point of view, here is one of the most controversial, clearly the most controversial jurist in the United States. A shot comes through the window, hits the seat where he was just sitting, and it just moved, and you're telling him that it was some drunk across the way who fired a shot into the air? You will not be surprised to know that the case of Harry Blackman has not been settled, and I don't think it ever will be. But it tells you that things don't come in neat packages in journalism. Yes?
Mr. Graham, two-part question. Of the justices that sit on the Supreme Court at this time, getting back to criminal justice and police officers, which way do you feel they tend to lean as far as their decisions and with the change in the justice or the Supreme Court in the upcoming years, in the swings of the left and the right? Which do you see as far as the decisions being made? Getting back right down to the court.
Yeah, the question was, how does the court stand in which various justices with regard to criminal decisions, and how can the future makeup of the court and changes in these justices affect that? The answer is that the Supreme Court really decided, although they didn't announce it, about 7 or 8 years ago, that the general thrust of the Warren Court's decision in this area had gone too far. There was no announcement, but as you probably know, you sound as if you're knowledgeable in these matters, the guiding principle of the Warren Court in these matters was that prophylactic rules could be issued from the Supreme Court, that is, like the Miranda decision, which says that in every case you must do this, you must say certain things. And like the so-called MAP decision having to do with search and seizure, it says in every case a policeman must do like this. And the stop and frisk cases and up and all down the line. The theory of the Warren Court was that the way the cop on the beat deals with citizens in the hurly-burly of dealing with crime can be dictated in advance by rules laid down from the Supreme Court. And I think that the majority of the justices have long since decided that that's too rigid, that decisions have to be made too fast, that the myriad circumstances that can confront a police officer are too complicated to fit into rules laid down in advance by the Supreme Court. And so there has been a process of relaxation by the justices, and the one that most recent is the so-called good faith exception to the exclusionary rule, which says that if an officer searches someone or someone's car, boat, house, whatever, believing that his search warrant is legal and proper, but it turns out later that, and in good faith thinking that he's doing right, if it turns out later that it was unconstitutional, that the evidence can still be used. So we are in a process, and I don't think that no matter who appoints the justices in the future, that process is going to be the dominant principle applied in the criminal law. The big wild card now is capital punishment, in which the court has said in general that capital punishment does not violate the Eighth Amendment's rule against cruel and unusual punishments. But yet, when the individual cases come to the court, in many instances they say, but the way it's being done is not fair and constitutional. It seems to me that if we have a more conservative court, that it will be much more willing to permit executions to go forward. I think we have time maybe for one more question. Right here. And then we will take that one back there. Mm-hmm.
In this age of big media and concentration of ownership and control of press in relatively few hands nowadays, as compared to bygone days when you had a myriad of members of the press functioning in independent capacity. I'm wondering how much, how freedom of press for a rank and file member of the profession compares with the freedom of the press of the bosses. Let's say an individual like Rupert Murdoch. How does his freedom of the press compare, let's say, with the freedom of the press of a hired hand such as yourself?
Well, for those of you who couldn't hear, the question boiled down to how is freedom of the press being preserved for the average journalist in an era of increasingly powerful press lords such as Rupert Murdoch. And as you know, H.L. Mencken put his finger on that when he says, we have freedom of the press for anyone who owns one. And Rupert Murdoch owns one. I guess the one glimmer of light in this situation is that despite the concentration of broadcast properties and print properties in the hands of people like Rupert Murdoch, as you know, that we probably have as much of a variety of media in this country as we've ever had, due to the proliferation of broadcast techniques that didn't exist before, microwave, satellites, cable, and the like. And in the print media, the remarkable proliferation of specialist kinds of magazines and to a certain extent newspapers. So it seems to me that we still have the variety of voices, so that given courageous and knowledgeable journalists, they can be heard. There was one back here, and I'll take that question and then we'll call it quits. Yes?
I was wondering about, there seems to be, I don't know if it's because of the rising conservatism, but like with CBS lately, I've seen, in particular CBS, the media in general, being labeled anti-Reagan and very liberal. What's your response to that?
Well, as I understood your question, was it that the media, and particularly television, had been labeled as anti-Reagan?
Yeah, liberal.
And liberal. Well, of course, there have been allegations that the media is liberal, and I think with some justification. I think that it is in the nature of a journalist not to accept the status quo. That's the way our heads are turned. Everything we do teaches us to instinctively look at the way things are and say, is it true? Is it in the public interest? Should it be changed? Should it be examined? And that is not the mindset of what we would say is normally the traditional conservative mindset, which tends to say that stick with the status quo, because stability is important. But where I thought you were going in your question is what I have heard in the last 6 months. There has been talk that perhaps the broadcast networks have not been as critical of Ronald Reagan as they had been. and perhaps not as much as they should be. And I think there's a serious, I know that people are asking, because I have heard it, and in some cases seen it raised in print, if the networks are being critical enough of the president. And I don't mean hostile to the president, but I have seen questions asked. Is the national news media casting as critical an eye as it should at, let's say, what the president is doing in his Contra policies, or the current policy toward Gaddafi? Maybe I've missed it, but I have not seen the news media, print or journalistic, focus a very critical eye at our current policy with regard to Gaddafi, which, as we read the paper today, appears to be heading us toward a substantial military confrontation. I read the editorial pages, watch television. You don't see a very critical view of that. So I think I hear questions being raised on the other side of that coin. And it's a logical thing when you have an extremely popular and persuasive president, as we have. But it seems to me that the concern of a journalist should not be that we might be criticized by holding up public officials to excessive scrutiny, but that perhaps if we have failed to throw the light of scrutiny, journalistic scrutiny, on what public officials are doing, because that's our role. Thank you all very much. I've certainly enjoyed this, and I hope you have too.